Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for the chance to maybe talk about some of the things that we're seeing relative to shale energy development we can see more broadly. In our case, specifically when we're talking about Pennsylvania, and we'll talk about a number of issues that really go beyond Pennsylvania. We'll talk about this from a global standpoint. We do a lot of work around the world. We'll highlight some of that, but also we think about this from a North American standpoint. So it's really more than just about Pennsylvania. The reason we often come back to Pennsylvania, as was just mentioned, we have a mission as part of our outreach effort within the university system as a land grant, as was specified. So part of our mission is to educate the many stakeholders in a variety of different topics. This one we've broken out because there's been such a high level of interest, and not just within the state of Pennsylvania, but contiguous states around Pennsylvania, and the many other places around North America as we think about gas development that's going on, or shale energy, as I said previously. So we think about a lot of shale oil development that's now occurring in a number of different states. And also when we think about that, we also move into western parts of Canada, and now into even the eastern parts of Canada, and then down into Mexico, as Mexico is now starting to liberalize their policies, and we look to do more in terms of outreach and stakeholder engagement, and certainly some of the technical components as we think about that marketplace as well. So tonight we'll talk in the time frame that I have, and hopefully we'll get some questions in the end too. I always find that questions are the most interesting and probably the most telling part of the opportunity to speak with people. So we'll get to some questions, and hopefully you've come with some. And if not, hopefully we'll generate some interest here as we go through the presentation, talk about some things that might be of interest to you, either in the global context or in your certainly national context here in New Zealand. So we'll talk about a number of different points as we go through. I always frame my conversation when I start a lot of the things, whether we're talking about regulatory considerations, whether we're talking about transparency issues, whether we're talking about social license relative to this topic, certainly all the environmental themes. We always start that process by talking about what are some of the economic considerations that are driving that process and moving it forward. So we try to use that as a foundational piece, and we'll use that in the same context here this evening. But we'll talk about some of the other components, where the technology is going, how quickly this is evolving and emerging. One is a new part of the industry, the unconventional component. Again, it's the same industry players, or largely the same industry players, but a retooling and a reemergence in different parts of the world, different communities when you get down to the very local level. And also some of the technologies that are coming to bear as we see this going. And then also talking about some of the risks. Because really this conversation in a lot of different ways is really about risk and mitigating risk, or managing risk, as we think about, again, the impact of this development as it's occurring in a number of locations. A little bit about our center. As our name would imply, we do research and we do outreach. Again, our mission from the land grant system is to do the outreach piece, but outreach without nesting that in good research is really, in our opinion, is not necessarily the best use of time, and certainly not the best use of information, so we try to couple the two of them together. The research that we do covers a variety of different things, and I'll just give you a quick showing with 3 quick slides, give you an idea what we consider when we think about research and some of the work that we're doing in that regard. But we break this down into what's below ground, or the downhole consideration, typically what's thought of as maybe the more technical side, the more conventional part, the drilling, the hydraulic fracturing, all the other considerations that would be attached in between those two. A lot of the lead-up work, and we think about some of the assessment of the resource as well, the seismic work, but also the above-ground piece. So we think about the above-ground considerations, or above-ground risk as we often refer to them. We think about community impacts. We think about long-term planning. We think about utilization. Again, thinking about this over a long spectrum of time, not just the development of the resource, but what are we going to do with the resource down the road, or how are we going to retool or reorganize and move from one type of energy source, or multiple types of energy source actually. But when we think about fossil, we think about oil and gas, how we're going to go from the conventional side to this unconventional side, how we're going to utilize once we discover what we have. And a number of other ones that I mentioned, workforce, business development, mentioned about governance, we think about transparency issues, many considerations that are tied in with that. Some of the other things that, as we think about the research side, so if that's the research angle on the piece that we do, and again, we're trying to merge the research piece and the outreach piece, but we have a number of different entities that are on campus that look at very specific parts of this. So we're a pretty big institution as well. We have, I think there's 96,000 students in all of our different campuses together. We have 22 branch campuses and then the main campus where we have about half of those. We have 500 researchers that are working in some aspect of energy. So it might be hydrogen, it might be renewables, it might be nuclear, it might be in fossil, it might be fossil broken out to coal or oil, gas, whatever it might be. But again, a variety of people looking at different components. We see with the unconventionals, it's generated a renewed interest or an expanded interest, we'll say, even in the legal side. So we have our legal school. We have a component within the campus system that is training the next generation of attorneys. We find out that they have a very deep part to play in this particular story. We also have the social aspect, our Social Science Research Institute. We're also training with our top core group. We're training regulators. So thinking about who are going to be the environmental regulators or the governmental regulators watching this process over the course of time. So we're also watching and training them for 38 states in conjunction with 2 other universities, Colorado School of Mines and University of Texas. So again, trying to put a lot of emphasis into not just where we're at the moment, but where this moment is going to expand to going forward. So definitely interest in that. And then just a quick snapshot of some of the issues that we see from a research standpoint. A place that is a state, and quite frankly, I think it's a list that would be a national list. And again, quite frankly, I think a global list when you think about what are some of the issues that are attached to development unconventionals. You'll see a number of issues there. Again, just kind of a generalized list, but you'll see issues there that would be very similar to conventional. But there's some nuanced differences that we've broken out and we're looking at very specifically. We think about, in this case, the development of natural gas from shale or oil coming or liquids coming from the same. But a number of issues that are points of interest to us, places that we're already doing some work and places that we're looking to invest some money coming from some of the tax revenue and from some other sources, corporate interest into some of these as well. Very specifically, when we start breaking them down, we start to look at places like water, and you can't have a conversation dealing with unconventionals and thinking about gas development without thinking about impacts to water, either on the surface, or the groundwater, or thinking about the ramifications of things like wellbore integrity. And are we going to see methane migration from depth or fluid migration from depth? And is that going to impact water in whatever type? Again, either coming to the surface or certainly impacting groundwater and the interaction that would have with communities or people that are certainly dependent upon those same sources of water over time. So we spend a lot of time teaching about that. Again, outreach to the broader communities, to the broader publics out there, the many stakeholders we have. And we define stakeholders in a lot of different ways. Not just talking about the general public walking down the street. We're thinking a lot of work that we do with elected officials, with regulators themselves. We teach a lot of industry players about the industry itself. As companies are making transition from maybe coal companies to oil and gas, or moving through the timeline from a more conventional type of a company, conventional oil and gas, into unconventional. So we work with that as well. Again, maybe just to finish out the list of some of the points of interest or research topics that we spend time on that we think are important. And again, we see generation of questions around this as we go forward. The other piece that we do is we spend a considerable amount of time working the outreach piece. And I have a colleague, the other co-director, Mike Arthur, and he does a lot more of the research, a little bit of the outreach. I do a lot of the outreach. He does a little bit or I do a little bit of the research as well. So we see some value in sourcing that. We have a team of people, again, that are working in this. But the outreach piece is a place that we spend a lot of time, and a point that I'll make here tonight several times, as we think about that social license or that engagement with the many communities that we deal with. So again, you'll see me embed that in a number of the points that I make. The engagement that I talked about, the stakeholder engagement, a short list of some of the folks that we work with, some that I've mentioned already, but as was mentioned in the beginning, we see some of these polls, we see some of the dialogue that's occurring in the community. We've seen this over the course of several years now, as the first shale well in Pennsylvania for shale well in Texas was back in the 90s, so maybe, again, going back to the comments that were made in the introduction. Texas is Texas. I mean, they've been developing oil and gas down there for a long, long time, decades and decades worth of time. So the mindset there is certainly go forth and drill more holes and produce resource and sell the resource. Pennsylvania, by chance, is in the States, is considered where oil and gas started. First well was drilled back in the 1850s, 1859, I believe. So it's been at it for a long time. We have a lot of wells, but not a lot of production. So there's shallow wells, very little yield, but a lot of holes in the ground. And that's generated a number of issues, and communities are concerned about that, express those concerns in the work that we do. And again, one of the reasons and one of the drivers for us in the work that we do to try to provide science-based research, science-based education to them. So we do a couple hundred outreach sessions in the course of a year. We think that's a very important part of the dialogue. We also, as I was pointing out to a group earlier, we try to teach specific things as we're working with crowds of people that we're dealing with, either in face-to-face sessions like this or in some of the distance-type learning webinars and Polycom conferences and a variety of different ways that we converse with our publics out there. One of the things we talk about, again, as I referenced to the group before, was dealing about risk and managing risk. And as I indicated several times here, we think risk is a big part of this conversation, and it's something that we think we need to keep embedding as we go. And I used this particular conversation, this particular picture for a specific reason. If you look very closely, the gentleman that's carrying the sign has a perception that there's risk attached to the activity, thinking about hydraulic fracking, or fracking as it's typically referred to as people kind of sum up the entire process. So he has a perception about that, but if you look very closely, and a perception of risk involved in that, obviously thinking it's riskier, he wouldn't be carrying the sign, or you would assume. But if you look at the gentleman very closely, you see he's smoking a cigarette. So, his perception of one risk compared to the perception of another risk, you can work through the dynamics of what that actually means. The point is, we try to teach about the science, and we try to teach about how you think through that process in particular. We also think about, as we're working through this, we're trying to broaden people's appreciation for energy and energy development, where energy is sourced from, what it looks like over time, and what the impacts will be in a variety of different ways. Again, you can look at the pictures that are here and maybe see some of the ironies that are there. So this is in upstate New York, where there is essentially no shale gas development going on, and there's a lot of impact or conversation about impacts to their infrastructure in a variety of different ways. There's concerns there. This is in an area where there's a lot of wineries, there's a lot of agritourism, it's an area where there's a lot of lakes, where this particular picture was shot, and they're trying to put in an LPG facility, but on the other, so this gentleman obviously is opposed to it, but you can see on the other hand, he uses a lot of energy, LPG, the same that he's opposed to the storage. He's also in favor of that utilization piece. So it's a matter of trying to connect people to the energy and the sourcing of energy that they're using over the course of time. That's part of our mission. And then more broadly, what is the impact? So if you don't do this, and you want to use this, meaning making a selection of energy types, what will that mean? What will the impacts be to the landscape? What will the impacts be to communities? What will the impacts be to industries that are already in place? So we find quite often that people, including in this area, are opposed to natural gas. They're interested in wind turbine or wind power, but they're not interested, and there's a lot of ordinances that are in opposition that would not allow the siting of that same wind power, that they're in favor of that type of generation. So as we often say, they're in favor of wind generation as long as it's in Kansas and you send it in on a wire. And you understand the dynamics of that, but that is the reality as we see it, unfortunately. So we're in favor of science around all types of energy development, and as a nation, our policy is all the above. Whatever that might mean in different contexts and certainly in different opinions. So the siting of solar out in some of the drier areas, some of the areas that have been pre-designated for the development of that same type of energy development. So we see people that are interested, but again, maybe looking at it not necessarily in their backyard, but in some other part of the world, in that case, maybe out in the desert. But what will the implications of that be, of any type? So again, as we go back and we think, well, if you looked at Pennsylvania, and I think the Pennsylvania scenario is maybe an indicator of something on a national level, and quite frankly, a global scenario. And these two pictures are shot in two different parts of the world, but the situation applies. These are finished wells. I think there's, 5 of them there. Finished wells from conventional type development on one pad, draining several square miles of area, coming all that gas collected back through horizontal wells and collected on that pad, versus the type of energy development, one of the other contrasting types of energy development, thinking about solar, and sited on another area, and this is actually down in the Crimea, down in Ukraine, one of the larger solar facilities out there. If you're familiar, in our case, I should just give you one more indicator. So our number one industry in Pennsylvania, which it is in a lot of different places, is agriculture. So we're concerned about agricultural impacts of energy development, whatever type of energy development it is. Our number 2 industry is tourism, and they're neck and neck. They bounce back and forth. So something that looks industrial is not likely to be something that's going to attract a lot of tourism type dollars. So what this looks like over the course of time is of great interest to us. So we think about the implications of this compared to this. If you're familiar with the Crimea, you would know that some of that ground is some of the best topsoil in the entire world is in that region of Ukraine. So what are the implications of that? And we see that even within our state. Some solar, siting of solar near one of our better agricultural areas, and the impact and the pushback from the community that we need to protect our resource, in that case, our agricultural resource. So this is a very convoluted, very polarized conversation, and we see it played out in a variety of different ways. So let's move on from there. We talk about some of the other considerations that are attached to this. As we're thinking about risk, I often break that down into what's a possible risk and what's a probable risk. Because in this conversation, people talk about, well, it could pollute, thinking about the fossil energy, it could pollute the groundwater. Or it could have a certain air emission component to it. Or it could have well integrity issues. Wells might leak. A variety of different things can be pointed out, and we've seen issues that all those turn out to be true. The scenario is, well, how often does it happen? How high is that risk, and can that risk be managed? Can you have good regulation? Can you change processes? Can you revamp the engineering, or all the above to come up with something that's going to reduce that risk and reduce the probability of that occurring? Now, often we'll say, oh, it's possible this roof might fall down, but we're in here, we feel safe because we don't think that it's very probable. The same thing would apply in this case. So there's a lot of things that, again, are possible but may not be necessarily probable. So you weigh that against the value of the resource being developed and the benefits that are seen. We've seen some environmental benefits. We've seen green space that's being maintained, for instance. We see more pad development, but we see less farms that are now being converted as people, as farmers retire and might have sold land for development because they could use the cash stream, and moved off the farm and moved the farm away from agriculture. We see some of that now, those trends starting to slow anyway, in some cases reverse. We also see, obviously, the economic piece. Job development, we see resources in terms of dollars, capital that's being spent within communities. We see this talked about a bridge to someplace else. So this displacing coal utilization, for instance, is one of the big trends that we see. But other types of energy as well. And we're now even starting to see it displace nuclear. Some of the smaller, older nuclear plants that are coming offline, and some other ones that aren't so small and aren't so old that are now, the economics of running them compared to gas becoming less favorable, and some of the utility operators saying, well, they're going to decommission those plants and move away from them. Now, I don't know that we're going to see that wholesale in the States, but we do see some early sign of that trend, and to some that's a worrisome trend. Maybe here in New Zealand it would not be. But stateside, that's considered to some degree a worrisome trend. But a variety of things. We also see that the geopolitical, we think about energy security, and not just thinking about that, certainly not thinking about that just from a Pennsylvania perspective, but seeing that as a global piece. So countries that were struggling, maybe balance of payments, now might have a new opportunity with different types of energy development going forward. We also watch this trend about this broader move. We think about this on a global standpoint, and this golden age of gas and the many conversations that are wrapped around that, as we see a variety of countries that are moving in that direction. We'll show a map, and there are certainly some early movers in that regard. Some that made some early moves and are moving forward, seemingly with some speed. Some other ones that have made some steps that way are struggling, trying to figure out the geology or trying to get their regulatory or their tax schemes in order before they move any faster. Or certainly it's become a hindrance in some locations. But certainly some early movers that way. We see some of that in Europe. We watch the UK in particular. So at the highest levels of government, you have spokesmen, so to speak, that are stepping forward and saying, as a nation, we're going to develop this resource. We're going to go forward, we're going to drill holes, we're going to tap the resource, we're going to see the economic benefits as they frame the story, and we're going to move the story forward. So UK would be an example of that. Poland would be another. You could start to look at something like France and say, well, not so much. Not sure it's the right move politically, not sure it's the right move from an environmental standpoint. Some social implications of that. Tourism, again, we think about France. Tourism is a big industry, agriculture as well. So they're not so sure as to how the impacts of something like unconventional or shale would play out in that type of environment. So we see a slowing. We also see other ones that are attempting and making some of the moves. And as we watch the country Ukraine, for instance, that's struggling politically right now, a lot of the dynamics, and we were having some discussion even before we came down here tonight, a lot of those dynamics are being played out because of energy and the payment for energy to, as they often refer to, the big brother to the east of them. And as we play that out specifically, we see those Eastern European countries that in the past, and to some degree now, beholden to where their gas is coming from and the pricing that's attached to that. And we see the implications of that. I mentioned Ukraine, but you could start up in the Baltics and run all the way down to Bulgaria. And all those countries are as well as countries to the west of them, are looking at sourcing their energy from, again, the big brother to the east, and what that might mean in terms of an energy security. Is the energy going to come through? Is it going to be able to transit through Ukraine? We've seen some instances several different times where that's been problematic. And what will that mean in the long term? We're now starting to see Russia with Gazprom look to the eastern markets and thinking about supplying into Asia, for instance. That changes the dynamic. It opens up potentially a market for some other countries to supply Europe. It also changes the geopolitical considerations wrapped around that, the ramifications that would be a piece going forward. As we think about what this might be, when you look at the U.S. and you think about where gas is being sourced, we see some changes over time. I think the graphic displays it and walks through there pretty easily. You see how much was coming from shale. Initially, obviously, like I indicated before, you go back to the 90s. Prior to that, you wouldn't have seen any. It would have been essentially zero. And we've seen a big ramp that's occurred since then, and there's an expected ramp as we march forward, thinking again about this in the U.S. perspective. But I think you would see a very similar type picture even if you looked at a Canadian experience in a number of different ways. Not in all ways, but a number of different ways. And the expected accounting for shale gas being about 50% of the marketplace when you run out to the end of the timeline, but a number of private forecasts are looking at that could be closer to 70%. And when you look at the quick ramp up, which I'll show you, when you look at some of the individual states, and we'll use Pennsylvania as a benchmark there, we're seeing that could be attainable when you think about that. So where is the shale being developed? Back to the US experience. We're trying to work this down from a global down to a US and then down to a more localized type of level. Help you maybe to put that into context for how some of the conversations might be playing out here and where there might be some value in that regard. But we see where most of the development is occurring is with the Marcellus anyway. And the Utica shale is up here in the northeastern part. Proximity is a big driver. So again, if we're looking at economics, you've got a lot of capacity in place in terms of transmission, in terms of pipeline, compression, storage up in that part of the world as well. But you also now have a huge resource that's in close proximity, and you've got a big part of your market. Your high-end part of your market traditionally, historically, has been up in the northeast part of the U.S. Now that dynamic has changed dramatically because of the abundance and the development that has occurred. Now that's really starting to change that picture. Also remember, as I show another slide, here's the Haynesville down here. deeper wells, not so close to market, higher cost to produce that same gas. And the Eagle Ford down here, closer, more liquids. This is more gas, some of both, but this is more liquids and some oil. A lot of that going into the processing and the petrochemical complex that would be down in the Gulf area. So again, there's some dynamics in terms of location and where these resources are actually located. One of the things that we're seeing is the ramp up. Again, as I referenced that last map, and remember several of the points there, we talk about the Marcellus, we talk about this boost going forward, we talk about the Eagle Ford and some of the natural gas liquids and the oil that has an opportunity to go to marketplace in close proximity, but we look at the Haynesville that maybe doesn't have that same market outlet. With LNG shipments over the course of time, assuming more permitting goes that way, that trend will likely turn around. But right now we see these patterns that are very different than maybe what we would have thought even a couple years ago. We also, as we start to work this out, if you follow any of the shale developments and some of the different plays, there's a number of larger ones out there. There's some smaller ones as well. We don't mention some of the Niobrara, and there's a couple other ones in there that would be fields of interest. But you can see some of the big ones and some of the quantity that's coming out. And if you look at the Marcellus, there's a little bit of West Virginia data that's incorporated in there. You can see that it's turned out to be a very big deal compared to, again, just a couple years ago when there was no development that was occurring in that regard. And how much of even the U.S. Gas is being produced when you think about shale gas coming from there. The other thing to keep in mind as we think about those kind of numbers and some of the trends we'll show is in Pennsylvania, about 7,300 wells. We'll show a map, but about a third of the wells are not even hooked in yet. So they've been drilled. They may have been hydraulically fractured or not, gone through a well stimulation process or not. And again, they might not be online because of lack of gathering capacity, gathering pipeline or transmission line to bring that same gas to market. So the market is expecting that, and the pricing that we're seeing, the lower pricing of gas in the States, is partly dictated on a national basis by the fact that we have a lot of capacity there. Some places it's constrained for movement, other places a lot of capacity is being built. We're looking at about $100 billion, about a $10 billion pipeline build per year for 10 years. That's what the expectation is by industry estimates at this point in time. So a lot of capital still needs to be spent, a lot of pipe needs to be put in the ground. Again, when you think downstream, a lot of the implications of that, social implications as this reaches into more communities, environmental when you think about more pipe, more right-of-way, more clearances, more timber, you can just start playing it out in a lot of different ways. So a lot of implications there. This map will kind of build and give some kind of an idea. If you're not familiar with where everything is located, you got New York City up here, Philadelphia down here, Washington, D.C. down here. And this is the state of Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio. This is New York, when you can see where there's no development occurring up in New York because their regulatory process is not in motion. They've been working through redeveloping their regulations for about the last 5 years now. So a lot of public comment periods, a lot of revisions, a lot of other political ramifications in that location. So at this point in time, no movement forward in terms of development there. The resource, Marcellus and the Utica Shale both extend up into that area. We see a very similar situation here in the western part of Maryland, whereas again, West Virginia, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, the politics in those three locations or those three states said, go forth and produce the resource. And we'll keep evolving and updating and changing the regulations as the development is taking place. So working from the benchmark of what regulations were there for the industry that was already in place and modifying them, again, in parallel as the development is occurring, versus those other two locations where not so much. There were some questions before with the group about, well, okay, so if those wells are being produced, is this a process where you have to keep quickly drilling more wells because the wells that have been drilled, these shale wells, are declining rapidly? And the reality is, you get about half the production, and the decline curves here indicate that. You get about half of the production in about the first 2 to 2.5 to 3 years, depending upon where it is in the Marcellus or the Utica. That's what we're seeing. Okay? But we're also seeing the productivity of these wells over their lifetime is actually turning out to be much higher than most companies thought. Mid-single digits, the 5 to 6 billion cubic feet. Again, this is lifetime production, which lifetime on these wells, the expected life is 20 to 50 years, so it's a pretty long period of time. Most of it, like indicated, coming in the beginning. And these are roughly similar to declines that we're seeing in shale wells across the nation, including across Western Canada as well. So it's pretty similar. And then the other half of that production coming in the latter part, or the remaining several decades of life of those wells as it starts to run relatively flat. But if we looked at the Marcellus, we see this slow build, and again, this is a story that we have. Different shale wells, different geology in different parts of the world is not all the same. So our experience, our politics, our private ownership of minerals, the number of rigs that we have operating or available to develop this is different in the States as it might be different in Eastern or Western Europe, or it might be in Africa, parts of Africa or Asia, or potentially in this corner of the world as well. So we had a similar conversation like that in Australia last week. So it makes a difference. We recognize that. But these are the numbers and the trends and some of the changes that we've seen based on all those factors coming together, and some would call a perfect storm, some would call a perfect disaster. Those that obviously the 20% that you referenced that aren't so in favor of this would see all those things being problematic. We also recognize that in Pennsylvania, we were largely an import state for a long time, and now we've moved to an export state. And if you look at the new numbers, which just came out this week, we're now at 3.3 trillion cubic feet that have been produced from the state. So a lot of gas is being produced that was not being produced before because the technology to produce that gas was not necessarily known or being utilized. And we're seeing this consumption line here really being influenced. This is the gas consumption line. Within state, this is being largely influenced by the relationship between price of gas and the price of coal, because we have a lot of coal that's used for power generation. So that interplay or relationship then between different types of fossil energy and the historical patterns of the past or recent past, including right up to moment, and a new emerging dynamic that's there with shale gas coming in. We also, as we start to expand this back out a little bit, we can talk about some of the issues that we have in terms of the job build. So you think about the broader economic considerations that are attached, the number of jobs that are there. There's a lot of controversy as to how many jobs, depends whose assessment you use. We've done one as well, and ours is more midstream than maybe the other extremes that are out there. We see revenue generation is going back to the state. In our case, we do not have a severance tax, but we have an impact fee. So monies that are paid on a per well basis back to the state, redistributed back out to communities, and pay for a variety of different things: environmental considerations, infrastructure builds, road repairs, and a variety of things. There's 13 categories that those dollars can be spent on, and that number is about to jump to $600 million when the next payment is made here shortly. And then lastly, dollars that are recirculating within communities. So I mentioned we have private ownership of minerals, so those royalty dollars that are there are royalties that are paid to landowners that well might have been situated on or participating in that drilling unit. There's dollars then flowing back to those landowners. There's dollars being reinvested or recycled, we'll say, back within many of those communities, and we'll show that. But in our case, again, as we start to expand this back out, we see a lot of gas that's being developed. We see a lot of infrastructure that's being built. Roughly half of the transmission or half of the pipe infrastructure build that's going on in the States right now nationwide is somehow related to development that's dealing with the Marcellus. So the Marcellus is really a pretty big part of the story. The story is not just about Pennsylvania in that case, but it's a matter of what is the size of this resource and what is it doing to the historical patterns of how gas moves, of how energy is being sourced, and what the ramifications of that are, measured by whatever metric that you'd like to use, from economic all the way through environment and considering a variety of other things in between. But we know, as we think about that, let me back up, as we think about that, we also know that we find that there are constraints in the system. We'll talk about one of those in just a moment. Those constraints would be for individual users like power gen, which is the point that I'll make, or it might be in other ways that some of the product that's being developed as we think in this case, not just dry gas that's being developed, but also wet gas, meaning it has other hydrocarbons in it. The other hydrocarbons are natural gas liquids that have another market. Think propane and ethane and butane and other considerations there, other carbons that are in there that are then utilized for other industrial processes or we utilize someplace in our lives, thinking about propane, for instance. So we have to build infrastructure to be able to deliver some of those products to market. And again, there's ramifications to that when we think about this in a variety of different ways. Some of the constraints, so if the price of gas was kind of cruising along pretty level because of the influence that I mentioned, you've got a lot of supply chasing a certain demand from the market, and all of a sudden it gets very, very, very cold, and the constraints start to show up that the pipe is not made to carry as much gas as the market is calling for, you get these spikes. And we've clearly seen that. And now we see more political will, and you can see what it spiked to US dollars. This is actually not the eastern, you go up into the New England marketplace and look at Boston. Price in that area paid by power generators actually crested at $100 a unit. Keep in mind these for just a short period of time measured in days, but keep in mind that that same unit of gas was selling for several dollars a unit, $3.50, $4 a unit, somewhere in that range just prior to that. So a cold spell can then illustrate some of these issues. So constraints in the market, constraints in the politics that will allow more pipe to go in the ground to utilize the resource is something that we see as well. And again, something that we enter into in the conversation. I would sum up this graph by saying more out, less in. So we look at this on a North American standpoint, thinking about Mexico and thinking about Canada as well. We see we'll be likely exporting more gas. We're already doing that, sending gas that had not been sending nearly this amount into Mexico or into Canada, especially into eastern Canada. We have been buying gas from eastern Canada that was coming, transiting across for western Canada. Now we're sending gas the other way. So reversing capacity to do that, the expectation is that that will be coming from Marcellus or is coming from Marcellus and will be for quite some time. And it's really more than a story about Marcellus. There's other shales. And again, the interconnect between these different pipelines, bringing it from other shales that are even below us when we think about Pennsylvania. And less coming in to our coast. And maybe just another illustration when you think about Mexico scenario, you can see the rapid bump or increase in this. And if you looked at the graph to Canada, you would see a very similar type scenario. This is the point that we want to illustrate here. So this is the price of crude on a per barrel basis. This is the price of a unit of natural gas. We see this divergence, we see this separation between the pricing between those two. And the story as we think about this is not just, well, that's interesting graph, Tom. What does that really mean to us? What the story is really talking about is talking about, well, what's that trend likely to do and what kind of decisions are being made around that? So we're seeing, and I'll illustrate that with some numbers here, we're seeing manufacturing patterns change potentially. We're seeing some of the politics change around that. We're seeing new industries that are sprouting up because of this type of separation and where the expectation of where a unit of gas will be priced over the course of time. So as we start to go down that road and segue in that direction, we see other units of energy. The price of them or the trend lines in them, and although some of the movements might be small in time, we can still see that there's a relatively large drop when we think about the price of natural gas, thinking about that from a feedstock or an energy source and where those trend lines. So if you back up to the graph before, you recognize that a lot of companies are making decisions on where they see that spread going or where those trends seem to be going over time. You can look 3 years out in the futures market and you can see that is playing out in that same direction. So as we think that out, our story has started to switch from this part about development of gas to, as we're multiple years into this now, to the utilization of gas. So where is the gas going to go? Who's going to use it? What's it going to be used for? What value is going to be added to it versus a commodity, either to go offshore, which some of that is definitely going to occur from what all indications are, what permits have been issued. But again, looking at some other industries that are looking to utilize this, and looking even as this reshoring is occurring, looking at some of the differences that other countries are saying, we need to develop our resource. And that's one of the conversations you clearly hear when you're in Germany. You clearly hear it at the highest political levels and certainly at the industry levels. When you go to UK, that we're going to lose some of our heavy manufacturing or intensive, energy-intensive industry to other parts of the world, in particular seeing it go to the States. And they're not interested in doing that, just like you wouldn't be interested. So trying to preserve industry and having a resource, develop a resource if they see it, and that's largely the conversation that's taking place. So high energy costs, whether it's gas or whether it's electric, and some of those locations, and it does seem to be driving this reshoring of industry coming back stateside, or looking at new industry coming in. And crank through some other numbers as well. Again, when you think about some of the industries that are expanding their footprint, or some that are coming in, and ones to some degree that might not have been there. Our president, in his most recent State of the Union address, was talking about this $100 billion number in terms of announced projects in the next 3 years. So capital expenditures to develop industries that will be utilizing this, that are directly reporting that's due to the price of natural gas, or the shale energy as it's moving forward. To highlight a couple of these quickly, we can see the power trend out there, or the power gen trend, I should say. The amount of looking at where this is going, and we can look at an example, and there's many examples like this across the nation. Pennsylvania was the easiest one for us to pull out, or maybe we thought it was the most, illustrated the situation the best. You can see there's 9 plants. You can see the amount of megawatts that are being generated by that. It's very substantial. And these are located in close proximity to where the resource is developed. So again, we're looking at a lot of infrastructure build. We're seeing coal come offline. Then there's that question, well, what's driving it? Is the market force driving it? Or is regulation driving it at the federal level in that case? And we're seeing likely some of both. So the war on coal that we're having, or that's often talked about in the states, and certainly in Washington, driving part of that, and then the market forces, just like I mentioned about the nuclear that's driving, market forces that are driving that. We look at environmental considerations. We look at some of the conversions that are taking place, record number of homes, especially in the northeastern part of the U.S. where a lot are on fuel oil. We see a number of those that are converting over to electric because of the lower cost of electric or the lower price of gas. And what we're hearing, our president was saying that the savings on a per family basis with the lowering of the price of gas, if you factor that all the way through the process and think about all the ramifications in industry and power and other considerations there, it's about a $1,200 stipend on a per family basis. So it's playing out with a lot of different people in a lot of different ways. And even in the change or the shift from onshore or offshore to onshore. Another big change we're seeing is this move in the infrastructure. So again, on a national basis, and again at our highest political, the federal level, but played out from the federal level all the way down to the local level, and then certainly the private sector as well, finding an opportunity from the utilizing natural gas in a variety of different ways for transportation. Now, it would appear that heavy industry is going to move that way a little quicker. We even see, and we were talking about earlier, marine applications. You think about locomotives that are running now, and some new interest from some of the companies that are building them to move to LNG. Light industry, or light transportation, I should say, light vehicles, maybe not so much. Manufacturers seem to be a little slow to that. Our conversations with them, not moving so rapidly that way. And then the big question, who builds the infrastructure? Do you build the infrastructure and drive the transportation conversion, or do you start to convert the transportation and the infrastructure follows? So the chicken or the egg scenario played out. So you see a lot of different things in that regard. You see more R&D for engine technologies. Certainly a place for, as we think about academia, or we think about engineering, we think about a number of other considerations there. We think about material sciences and the changes that we'll need in those regards going forward. But we also see that entrepreneurial piece and this idea about more investment in GTLs. So can you utilize the infrastructure you have in place? Can you take natural gas and convert it, which you obviously can, but can you convert it in a way that is economically feasible into a liquid fuel, and into a liquid fuel that you can dispense through infrastructure that you already have in place? So that's then become a big part of the conversation. And we see that not scaled to the billion-dollar level, but scaled to the tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars in terms of the scale of those type of GTL processes. and also those that will use catalysts that can toggle back and forth between biomass or natural gas, depending upon what the opportunity might be. So again, it seems like there's investment opportunities, and we certainly see lots of research going into that, lots of R&D. LNG, which we'll talk about, number of projects have been approved. I think the question is, well, how much will be in that regard going forward? And again, as we start to then bring this back down, so if that's up at the national, what does it mean within individual communities? So a couple quick slides maybe to make some illustrations in that regard. I mentioned about the $700+ million of recycled royalties and lease payments to landowners, but we also see companies that are now investing as they're drilling those 7,300 odd wells in Pennsylvania, spending a lot of money, billions of dollars in Pennsylvania. Is making an impact in terms of new businesses. It's making an impact certainly in terms of workforce and such. So there's lots of statistics out there. So there's some pros and cons of this process. Again, it's a very polarized type of a conversation, but the economic piece seems to be relatively straightforward, and you can clearly see some of these gains over time. And then new industries are coming in. Here in southwestern Pennsylvania, as well as in some of the surrounding states in that corner of the world, a kind of a regional area, looking at processing, looking at petrochemicals, looking at intensive energy like manufacturing, thinking about steel industry that had largely moved away and now is moving back. So again, a number of those announced projects, other types of chemicals, rubber manufacturing, things of that nature, but things that are coming back into an area that had not seen them ever or had not seen them to the same type scale. Also broke this down into 3 individual counties. These are up in the northern tier of Pennsylvania, north central part, where a lot of development is going on. And essentially 75% of the gas coming out of Pennsylvania right now is coming out of 6 counties, 4 in the north central, northeastern part, closer like New York City, and 2 to the southwestern corner, which is where a lot of those NGLs or the wet gas is, and down near the Pittsburgh area. But if you go to that north central where a lot of that volume is coming from and look, well, what impact has it had? So we've measured things like impacts to real estate values, impacts to agriculture, impacts to airports. We measure things like revenue generation. So think about new people coming in, paying taxes when they stay at a hotel, where those taxes are going, and the impact then to those specific locations. These dollars uniquely go towards tourist promotion afterwards. So the more dollars, the more promotion, the more you keep an industry that was there in place before this occurred intact. And that ramp has largely occurred, that's all occurred inside of the shale development. Rail traffic, again, some of those maybe off the grid type conversations, but a place that we see impacts out there and some very large ramifications. You look at Lycoming, number of rail cars prior to the shale that were dealing with some of the same considerations like stone coming in or sand, the proppant or pipe, variety of other things, and you can see how big those bumps are, and you can see the implications over time. We also look at things like sales tax collections. So again, what are some of the barometers that we use to gauge how big of an impact this is into the many communities, or collectively into the state of Pennsylvania this might be. And we see this play out in a variety of states, so this isn't unique to Pennsylvania. Ohio has some really good numbers out to the state to the west of us that would show a lot of very, very similar type of trends out there. And keep in mind, this is in a time frame, if you look at the numbers up here, the dates up here, this is in a time frame that our economy has been struggling as a nation, but certainly struggling as a state. So we're seeing, again, some indications of what this type of development looks like. I want to be very careful and say that this is not plugging for an industry. It's indicating some of the trends that we're seeing out there, and I think it's very important to recognize the statistics and how they're playing out in that regard. We also look at some of the other considerations. We think about some of the environmental components. We think about training the workforce of the future. We think about training those regulators, as I mentioned before. So working and training that group as they come forward, and also seeing that a lot of those are transitioning over time. As they're trained, often what we do is we see them move to industry or move to some other sector. So you see that revolving door, and it's important to make sure that we're putting trained people back in. So if there is going to be the social license out there in time and public trust in that there is a training process to make sure that they understand the latest techniques, the latest technology, or the geology and general understanding of what it is that they're responsible for, either in permitting or inspection when we think about the regulatory considerations there. But a variety of other things. What are the true risks, as I mentioned before in the beginning? trying to work through that, making sure we're documenting baseline data. One of the things we found in the beginning of our process is most people had not tested their public water or their private water wells. So we had 1.2 wells in private wells in Pennsylvania. Most people had never tested their water, as hard as that is to believe. Never tested their water. So what we found was 40% of those wells, 40% had some sort of a health-based parameter that had been, a federal parameter that had been breached. 40% of the wells. We also found that 25% of them, through this testing process, had detectable methane in their water already. So before there was any drilling, they already had methane in their water. So you can see some of the ramifications of that as that plays out from a legal standpoint or people's appreciation or understanding. And they're trying to understand this industry as it's moving into their backyards, the same place they're sourcing that water. What do they have to start with? What are the baseline? And what kind of changes are there to be monitored over time? So important considerations. We also think about where the gaps, research gaps, again, come from an academic standpoint. What can we learn from where we are right now? What are we missing in that story? What are some of the issues that are raised? What do we still need to determine? And the last one I want to mention on there is maybe an example of some efforts coming together. You have the NGO community, E-NGO community. You have some foundation support. You have government, you have academia, and you have industry all coming together in that regard and putting together an organization that will provide, look at best management practices, so environmental best management practices, good drilling practices, and then do environmental audits. So the best companies then will go through that audit process in a very transparent kind of a way and then float to the public or float to the surface, where some other ones either would refuse to go through that process, although it's a voluntary process, it is a voluntary process, or go through and not come out with necessarily the best of audit, again in a very public kind of way. Then that would be known to and the pressure, the public pressure, and the regulatory pressure to change some of the ways there. So some good things that have come from that type of grouping together. And lastly, some of the regulatory issues that we would see, thinking about some of the things that we've discovered to date. Certainly water, we think about the quantity issue, but certainly quality issues. Quantity is not so much our problem. We think about Pennsylvania, but when you go to Texas, that would be a major problem. Or down in the arid Southwest, we do some work in parts of South America. We do some work in parts of Africa, some dialogue in Australia as well, certainly some very arid parts of the world. So where would the quantity of water that they would need, what kind of quality issues could be impacted, or what water quality issues could be impacted over the course of time, and a variety of other things dealing with water, all the way down through thinking about the waste and dealing with waste and recycling. Some of the processes that we've changed over time through good regulation. I think good regulation is the fact that we've moved from surface discharge of fluids, in this case waters, to now recycling almost all the water that's being used, and what's not recycled then going into disposal wells. And we have about 10% of the waste stream going into disposal wells. And the levels of brine or salinity get so high that it has to go in some other different process. But we also look at issues of norm. A lot of questions about norm out there. So we think about this black shale can yield low-level radioactive waste. Is the waste manageable waste? Does it have to be disposed of in a certain way? Does it build up in pipe? Does it build up in other parts of the infrastructure? And some of the gaps, again, the research gaps that need to be understood better about that. And also thinking about induced seismicity, and maybe an issue that would be of interest here in particular. But I think any place around the world you talk about the potential for inducing an earthquake, people listen. And we're seeing in a number of locations within the US where you have underground disposal wells, not enough is known about the geology of microseismic has not been done, regulations are not robust enough, and you induce seismicity, induce small earthquakes. Some of these they're all measurable, but some of these can be felt at surface and most of them cannot. But still, inducing seismicity is not considered to be a good thing. So looking at earthquakes from disposal wells that you have high pressure, high volumes for long periods of time versus the hydraulic fracturing that's not causing those small earthquakes because you have all the same elements, but you have much shorter periods of time. So again, some of the things that we've learned in that process. And just going forward, some of the very ending points that I want to make here, we think about this utilization. As I've mentioned, one of the big trends that we're seeing is moving, although there's still a lot of science to be discovered about some of the downhole considerations here, including the ones that I just mentioned, I think more of the conversation is going towards the utilization piece. That's clearly what we're seeing from a political level as well as from the industry standpoint, all the way down to the exports, some of the legal and some of the regulatory and permitting that comes to that, and then down to that social license piece. What have we learned in that process? What have we learned through these many considerations that we've talked about here? And how do we apply that into many communities as people are trying to learn, understand the science? And I think there was a point made in the beginning that even in Texas, as well as nationally, most people don't, if you ask them the question, do you know what hydraulic fracturing is? Which is certainly a buzzword out there, or fracking in short, most people don't know what it is. Those that do know what it is divide very quickly into two different camps. So, it's very important to recognize there's still a lot of education to go on relative to social licenses. People are coming to the story as it shows up in their community, and then they want to know, well, what does it mean to us? For all those different ways, environmental, social, some of the technical, but a variety of different components that are in there. And then lastly, I'm going to leave you with these 5 questions, just some thoughts to maybe mull around, or if you wanted to talk about them quickly. We think about when this starts out in a lot of places, shale development, unconventional development in a lot of places in the world, some locations like New York, it's a stop and hold and work through the process in whatever length of time that is, and then start the process potentially going forward, because it may not go forward. Politics, again, may not be right. Social acceptance or social license may not be right, or a variety of other factors might step in there. Or is it a matter of working in sequence or working in parallel with the development as it's occurring? And so the question, do you start with a blank sheet or do you use something that's already in motion? Another one there, thinking about this idea about predictability. We talk about investment of dollars. I mentioned a number of times here about the number of dollars. We think about this North America-wise, number of dollars that are being spent, but there needs to be some kind of commercial viability or predictability there for companies before they're going to spend that money. A no-brainer, certainly you recognize that. In any type of development, that would be the case. Where we're talking about, in this case, where there's a social license piece that's much harder, it's not so tangible, it's not so easy to measure, that then becomes that unpredictability or the change of regulations over the course of time that might not seem so continual, but might seem jerkier or have a lot more cycle to them to companies. Then they look at, well, what are the other locations that we have to develop the resource other than this location? So we see that. What about this longer term strategy? And are the decisions made just about for environmental reasons, or is it that all the above that we're looking at all the energy development and what the pros and cons and how to mitigate risk and what are the ramifications of one versus the other? Public involvement. How deeply do you involve the public? And I use 2 examples. In Norway, when they put out something for public comment, my Norwegian colleagues will tell me they'll get a couple hundred comments back. And a lot of those comments are good comments that actually change the regulations or change the process going forward. New York, they did the same thing. They had several 100,000 comments. So the idea, how do you work through that? BLM, the Bureau of Land Management in the U.S. on public ground did the same thing. By on their frac rules, the last comment that I heard from them, they had 1.7 million comments come back. So again, how do you work through that process if you're trying to do this in some sort of a way forward that makes some kind of sense, measured in time or measured in outcome? And then the last one about building some kind of stability or trust, and that really comes down to the transparency issue and then any parts that would be attached thereof.